Every time we were broadening our tax base, the tax to GDP ratio was actually falling. What kind of a broadening was that? So that's the first point I want to make. Second, Abdullah Yusuf Saab mentioned there are tax assessees who actually have an NTN. It's actually 3.1 and not 3.5. It's 3.1. You'll be pleased to know, last year, I'm talking about 2011, only 550,000 actually filed a return. What is even more interesting is out of the 47,000 corporations or companies with NTN registration, only 14,000 actually filed it. We're not talking about individuals. Let me take it forward. Tax to GDP ratios confuses me. Let me throw another statistic to you. Much simpler. You and I would have difficulty identifying Guatemala on the map. Guatemala is a country in Central America with 14.4 million people. Has more taxpayers than Pakistan. So these tax to GDP ratios confuses the issue. What on earth are we trying to do? And you take it forward, and someone mentioned very rightly, there is this issue of the expenditure side. And I'll come to that in a moment, but just to highlight two numbers for you. So you can understand the nature of the problem. We are looking towards the Kerry-Lugar bill giving us $1.5 billion a year. By the way, that's 3 months losses of the power sector. 3 months losses of the power sector. We're losing $1 billion a day. 700,000 rupees a minute. By the time this session ends, I'm always reminded when I look at my, I'm very fond of playing on my BlackBerry when I find some of the proceedings in a meeting boring. Because my reflexes are slow, you and I both know what it means, and after 2 or 3 moves it says game over. So every time I look at the Pakistan budget and see all this, you discover it's game over. Because the reality is, the power sector is losing 1.2 billion rupees a day. Steel mills, railways, and PIA are losing 200,000 rupees a minute. PIA 110 million rupees a day. Nonsense. That I read some statement this morning is utter nonsense. So the reality is the expenditure side. What are you going to do on the expenditure side? So there is this whole business of the world looking at you, asking a very simple question. Gentlemen, what are you going to do yourself? Why am I supposed to bail you out? Chachi Hillary wants to know, why should he bail you out? Let's move on. How will it affect us? I talked about exports. Because if you recall, I'd said, if they want to run trade surpluses, who are we going to sell it to? And I'll come to that in a moment. Second, which no one mentioned, the panel talked about it, investment flows from abroad. If people are worried about their own home countries, if there is a fair amount of, we all know, capital liquidity out in the world, they will first look at the home country, then look for security, and then look for opportunities elsewhere. The third is remittances, yeah? The Pakistani diaspora lives in these countries, right? If they go through a depression, will remittance flows be the same? So that's the third point. Let me move on to the next one. Just to give you an example of capital flows, I was looking at capital flows. In the second half of last year, i.e. between July and December, the gross capital flows in the world were 170 billion, which had dropped from 310 billion in the previous year. So those kinds of numbers are there. Someone talked about our exports being 25 last year. There is a talk of 23 if you're lucky. This year, a lot of our exports are actually linked to commodity prices, all kinds, just for this year. Going forward, who knows? This year alone, the estimates suggest that commodity prices will fall by 24%. Okay. Let me come to the next point. It is time we looked for markets where there are younger people. There is no point looking, and the bulk of our trade is towards the West. That's an aging population, right? It's the young who spend. The young populations are the one which are consumers. The young like you sitting here, you don't go out and buy one shirt like me because one shirt is good enough for me for 3 months. All consumption is impulsive, remember. When you go out and buy 5 shirts, it's not because you need 5 shirts. And it's the young who are actually consumers. And where are these young? It's in this direction. Again, the East, and much more importantly, our neighbors. We need to get on with our neighbors. And the obvious neighbor is India. Time to look at regional integration, time to look at trade, time to look for markets in this part of the world. So that's the other lesson of paradigm shift. The other reason for the paradigm shift, and I'm glad Professor Adil Najam referred to it. Yeah, whether we like it or not, our energy and water is actually linked with India. That's also a reality, right? So the need to look at this part of the world is for markets. That's where the young people are. That's where the consumers are. These are the growing markets. Second, that's where our links are for energy and water. Critical resources for the future. And I won't go into it because I think Professor Adil Najam did a better job than I would have on highlighting this part. The fourth reason to link up with these markets. You have 100 million people between the ages of 15 and 30. You have to give them productive employment opportunities. And the reason I highlight that is because there is a very large proportion of this population which was born, which we never educated, and which have very limited skills. So if you're going to sell in these markets, then there is some hope to be able to sell products where you can use a lot of this unskilled labor. That's also a reality. And of course, with something